Good evening, everyone. My name is David Birdsell. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, and I'd like to welcome you to the Spring 2006 Ackerman Lecture. We have a wonderful evening in store for you tonight as we talk about some of the most difficult issues in American society today, specifically focusing on issues of religion and the law. It's challenging to think about how to deal with issues that are at once so personal and so general, that so very much define our communities and define ourselves. When we talk about the race and social justice criteria that have animated so many of these Ackerman lectures, we tend to think about things that can often be put into large, sweeping scopes of public policy questions that, of course, as all public policy questions do, engage the personal, but in some ways, not exactly in the same respects that tonight's discussion will. I look very, very much forward to hearing our speakers talk about their own personal perspectives, their enormous expertise, and their learnedness on these topics, and sharing with us ways to think better about how we make public policies that are responsible to some of the things that make us most human.
To paraphrase Edmund Burke, the only thing necessary for evil to flourish is for good men to do nothing. Tonight, we have good, wise people saying and doing something about the important issue of our time. And so on behalf of my parents, on behalf of my husband, Erwin Engelman, myself, my daughter, Madeline, and Marion, I want to welcome you.
We're here today to talk about religion and the law. And as one of the most diverse colleges in America, I thought it was appropriate for us to take the lead on talking about an issue that is personal to each of us, whether you observe a religion or not, and to talk about how we can have a conversation about tolerance and acceptance, especially in a post-9/11 America. We know that our First Amendment to the Constitution talks about religious freedom, and in fact it is the cornerstone of many of the individual rights that is enshrined in our Bill of Rights. Many of the original colonists who came to America did so to escape religious persecution. However, they weren't always that good about treating their fellow citizens as well as they could have. How did we get to a point in time where we understand the need for a separation between church and state? What does that mean? And how do you manifest that separation in your own work on a day-to-day basis? That's the type of question I hope to engage our guests in helping us understand. Right now in our nation, we find ourselves sharply divided politically about many political decisions that are being influenced by issues of morality and faith. How do we talk about religion during those times of sharp and deep divisions, especially if those are reflected in our politics? We're going to start with Chaplain James Yi, who is a third-generation Chinese American and a graduate of West Point. He converted to Islam in April of 1991, and he served in the aftermath of the First Gulf War as a Patriot Fire Control officer. While in the Army, he also studied the Arabic language and traditional Islamic sciences. For 4 years, he engaged in intensive study that led to a certificate of Islamic studies equivalent to a graduate degree. An endorsement from the American Muslim Air Forces and the Veterans Affairs Council brought Chaplain Yi back to active duty as a U.S. Army Muslim chaplain in January of 2001. Following the terror attacks here in New York, Pennsylvania, and in Washington, Chaplain Yi represented Muslims in the military with great distinction, and that's a special honor that the Army does not give out to everyone, handling a multitude of national and global media requests about Muslims and Islam and their feelings about those attacks. He endeavored to educate soldiers about Islam by building bridges of understanding, and he was selected to serve as the Muslim chaplain for the U.S. prison camp at Guantanamo Bay. one of the things we're going to ask him to do is to take some time to share with us his thoughts and experiences during that time, which he's also written about in a book that he's brought with him today. And I encourage you to talk with him after the program about that. Guantanamo Bay has become so controversial for its treatment of those detained there that the U.S. government is actually now considering closing Guantanamo Bay. Because of his work there, Chaplain Yee was actually imprisoned for 76 days in September 2003 for allegedly spying, espionage, and aiding the accused Taliban and al-Qaeda prisoners. After months of intense government investigation, all criminal charges against him were dropped. With his record now clean, Chaplain Yee was reinstated to full duty at Fort Lewis, Washington. Again, something that does not happen very often in the military. He finally tendered his resignation from the Army and received an honorable discharge in January of 2005.
Yes, as I was introduced, I converted to Islam in 1991, and that was really through interfaith dialogue that spurred that. And it's an honor to be here with the other panelists, my brethren in faith here. Really, this program is showing that diversity and the importance of that interfaith in our society today. So I want to start with that. I also begin by telling you a little bit about myself. I am a West Point graduate. I graduated from the military academy in 1990. But I also come from a family that's really deeply rooted in the military. I have a younger brother who's also a West Point graduate. My other younger brother is a doctor, an Army doctor serving on active duty. And my father, who was also born here in the United States, was drafted during World War II. So all of the male members of my family, patriotically, has served this country in the armed forces. And that's something we're all proud of. But after serving a short time as an air defense artillery officer, I would come back into the ranks in 1991 as a Muslim chaplain after studying in Damascus, Syria for 4 to 5 years and learning a little bit of the Arabic language and the traditional Islamic studies. In September of that same year, in 2001, of course, we all witnessed on TV and right here in New York the tragic attacks on the World Trade Centers and on the Pentagon. And immediately during that time, I was called upon by senior levels in the military, by senior levels of the leadership in the military, to begin to talk about Islam to the troops. And I educated them about the Islamic culture, and of course distinguished Islam from extremism or terrorism, and answered many of the questions that the soldiers had after 9/11. They had many questions, and many Americans during that time had many questions about Islam. And I answered those questions, and as a result, many of those soldiers came away with a much better understanding of Islam. And that would be important because many of them would be deployed to places like Afghanistan or Iraq, and perhaps some of them have served 2 or 3 times now in Iraq. As a result of my contributions being praised and recognized, I would then be handpicked to be the Muslim chaplain assigned to the controversial prison camp operation down in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where at that time, in 2002, when I was sent there, some 660 individuals, all of the Muslim faith, were being held. Today, some 490 still remain, most without charges, being held indefinitely, and without really the basic standards of due process of the law. I want to take a real quick look at my role as a chaplain in the military. What's the role of the chaplain? Well, we have in our society a separation of church and state. So how is it that you have a clergy person operating in a government institution, the military? Well, the role of the chaplain is to uphold and defend that First Amendment fundamental freedom of religion. Chaplains, regardless of what faith they adhere to, and regardless of what faith the individuals in the armed forces adhere to, the chaplain protects and advocates for the free exercise of worship. And that's what gives legitimacy to chaplains in the military. Well, when I was assigned to Guantanamo, I didn't know what my role was going to be when I got down there, because this was a completely unique situation. I thought perhaps that I was being sent down to Guantanamo so that our government, the Pentagon, could say that, well, yes, we do have a Muslim chaplain assigned to this sensitive operation. So that means we're being sensitive to the religious needs of the prisoners we have here. Regardless of why I was sent there, I went down there with the same confidence that I had in myself to be able to communicate with others, to teach people about Islam, and to advocate for those fundamental values, American principles of diversity, tolerance, humane treatment for prisoners, and religious freedom. I got down to Guantanamo and would learn that my role was to be an advisor to the command on this unique religious paradigm where we do find that every single prisoner is of the Muslim faith. But I was also a chaplain to the prisoners who are being held in Guantanamo. And as such, I was granted authorized unescorted access into the prison cell blocks. I would listen to them and speak with them. Most importantly, I would listen to them. As we say in the military, a good chaplain is a good listener. And I would listen to what the prisoners had to say about what life is like for them down in Guantanamo. I would listen to their complaints of abuses and mistreatment. I would listen to their stories about some of the things that they were subjected to when they went to interrogation. Now, the interrogation or the intelligence operation down in Guantanamo is something I was far removed from as a chaplain, being unethical for a chaplain to aid the interrogators in trying to glean information from prisoners. I was, of course, assigned to the detention operation. But I was aware of what was going on there from what the prisoners would come back and tell me. And in chronicling my experience about Guantanamo, one of the chapters that I wrote about was entitled, or is entitled, Gitmo's Secret Weapon. And what is Gitmo's secret weapon? Well, from the vantage point of a chaplain, whose role is to defend the freedom of religion, Gitmo's secret weapon, from my vantage point, was the use of religion against the prisoners. And how was it being used? Well, prisoners would come and they would tell me, for example, that perhaps when they went to interrogation, they were put in the center of what was painted on the floor, a satanic circle. Of course, they're already shackled at the wrists, the waist, and at the ankles, as prisoners down in Guantanamo are shackled. And interrogators would attempt to force them to bow down and prostrate, like in the form of the Muslim prayer in the center of this satanic circle, while the interrogator was screaming at him that Satan is your God now, not Allah. This is an example of how religion was being used against the prisoners. How else? Well, we heard last year about the Newsweek story, the desecration of the Quran, something that outraged the entire Muslim world. I myself was, of course, outraged, because I knew from being down in Guantanamo firsthand that what was being reported by Newsweek could very well have been true. I can say that from being the Muslim chaplain down in Guantanamo, that the Quran was being desecrated. Guards, in the process of searching their cells as a matter of security, were initially allowed to search the Holy Quran, shaking the holy book violently, upside down to see if anything dangerous would fall out. Nothing ever did. But the pages themselves sometimes tore from the bindings. The bindings themselves were cracked and ripped. And this happened in front of the prisoners' eyes. And they became furiated. And they protested. And it led to riots and disturbances. Later, prisoners would even go further, carrying out more drastic measures, like hunger strikes and potential suicide attempts. But what would drive the prisoner to attempt suicide in protest of the Holy Quran and how it was being treated? Well, it was when interrogators took the Holy Quran and threw it on the floor and stepped on it. Prisoners came back and would tell me that interrogators kicked the Quran across the floor. Now, this is something that's actually confirmed in official U.S. military investigations. It's online. You could look in the U.S. Southern Command website and find the Schmidt report and find that these things were occurring. And when those things happened, this is what led prisoners to attempt suicide in protest of how the Holy Quran was being abused, mistreated, and desecrated. These are some quick examples of how religion was being used. And I raised some of these concerns as a chaplain to my chain of command. And most of the time, because they were happening in the intelligence arena, we didn't have any control over changing those type of behaviors. And then later, I would go on what I thought would be a 2-week break, coming home into the United States on what I thought would be a short 2-week leave and be back at Guantanamo to finish up my year of duty. After spending 10 months down in Guantanamo, I landed in Jacksonville Naval Air Station, and I was stopped by the customs officials. They would search my bags, my belongings, and disturbingly, I would later learn that actually it was the FBI who had contacted the customs officials before my arrival to Jacksonville, even as early as the day before, requesting specifically from them to identify me, single me out, and have my belongings searched. What was happening now was not an official customs search, but it was now a search conducted by an extension of a law enforcement agency, the FBI, without probable cause, a violation of my fundamental freedom or a right to be free from an illegal search and seizure. But that didn't really matter much to me because it's not like I really had anything. But then it would matter because these customs officials would say I had some suspicious documents. Suspicious documents then were handed over to military and federal intelligence agents who just, by the way, happened to be standing by. And then they called these documents classified, in which they got an arrest warrant and threw me in jail, which would ultimately be for 76 days in isolation. I was arrested in secret. I didn't show up at the airport like I was supposed to have. My wife and daughter had no idea what had happened. I had disappeared from society off the face of the earth. They would learn of what happened to me 10 days later when leaks to the media reported that I was arrested and had been charged with heinous crimes of spying, espionage, aiding the enemy, mutiny and sedition, all of which are capital crimes. I was even threatened with the death penalty. Well, I stayed in that cell for 76 days under very harsh conditions. I was even treated in many ways like an enemy combatant. When I was transferred to a super maximum security prison down in Charleston, South Carolina, I knew I was being treated just like an enemy combatant. I was shackled in the same way, at the wrists, the waist, and at the ankles, like prisoners in Guantanamo are shackled, in what we used to call a three-piece suit. Not a three-piece suit that you buy at the mall made by Armani, but a three-piece suit of chains. That's how I was shackled. Thrown in the back of a truck with an armed guard, 2 other armed guards in the front. And on the way down to Charleston, South Carolina, the guard next to me pulls out these goggles. They were black, painted, opaque, and puts them on my eyes. So now I can't see anything. He takes out these heavy industrial earmuffs, puts them on my ears. So now I can't hear anything. We call this tactic sensory deprivation. Sensory deprivation. Its purpose is to instill fear and intimidation. Of course, I knew about this tactic, because that's how I observed the prisoners down in Guantanamo in processing when they were transported from Afghanistan, in that very same tactic of sensory deprivation. I feared for my life, especially after listening to the prisoners who had told me down in Guantanamo that they were kicked and violently beaten sometimes when they were transported to Gitmo. I feared I would be the subject of that same violent kicking and beating. I feared that that armed guard could shoot me, and then it would be said of me later that I was trying to flee. So when they threw me in this cell, and even though it was in isolation, in this maximum security prison, I was at least relieved to be alive. Well, I would stay there for 76 days, and after 76 days, I would actually be suddenly released. I was never charged with espionage, spying, or aiding the enemy. I would be charged, though, with lesser offenses, like mishandling classified documents. By this time, I had retained a civilian attorney. I went to a pretrial hearing. The first thing my attorney did was just simply ask for the results of an official military review of these documents to show that I had something classified to substantiate these charges. I was still facing time in prison. Disturbingly, we learned that the government hadn't even initiated such a review. So the pretrial hearing was delayed again, and then again and again for these documents to be reviewed. But now it's not only these documents, but it's thousands of papers, which they're calling documents that were seized from federal raids on my house in Olympia, Washington, on the Muslim chapel at Fort Lewis, where I had served as a Muslim chaplain, from my office down in Guantanamo, and from my residence in Guantanamo. So now there's thousands of documents for the government and the military to investigate, to see if they can come up with one shred of classified information to substantiate these lesser offenses. After months of investigation, again, suddenly, these criminal charges would then just be dropped and disappeared. I was sent back to Fort Lewis, reinstated as a Muslim chaplain. My record was wiped clear, after which I would tender my resignation, and again, as we heard in the intro, I received an honorable discharge in January of 2005. Upon separation, I would also receive a Second Army Commendation Medal for exceptional meritorious service. But I never received an apology, a simple apology from the government or from the military in which someone said, sorry, we made a mistake. I didn't receive an apology, and that's something I strive for today. I consider myself an eternal optimist, and interestingly enough, the case is under investigation by the Department of Defense Inspector General, who is investigating and looking into how this happened to me, a West Point graduate, loyally serving his country, making huge contributions in this, even during this time where we have a war on terrorism taking place. I hope that will show that what happened to me was a gross miscarriage of justice, that mistakes were made, and that will lead to what I believe is a very well-deserved apology. I entitled the book that I wrote about my experience for God and country, Faith and Patriotism Under Fire. My faith was under fire. Simply, I'm a Muslim American. And when I and other Muslim Americans who are and were patriotically serving that Joint Task Force mission at Gitmo prayed, bowed and prostrated in the Islamic form of prayer, and when we read the Holy Quran in the classical Arabic language, that mirrored how the prisoners prayed and read the Holy Quran. And that meant to some down at Gitmo, a few who were inexperienced, overzealous, hypervigilant, even bigoted. It meant to them that we were also the enemy. My patriotism was under fire. Being sent to Guantanamo to advocate for diversity, tolerance, religious freedom, and humane treatment of prisoners also put me in the crosshairs by raising those concerns. But lastly, my ethnicity also played a role. Being a third-generation Chinese American also played a role in me being targeted. Because I would learn disturbingly again that while I was under investigation, someone had said of me, quote, "Who the hell does this Chinese Taliban think he is?" Telling us how to treat our prisoners. I was called a Chinese Taliban. Not just the Taliban, a Chinese Taliban. My ethnicity also played a role. And disturbingly, we have individuals, even at senior levels, who do harbor negative feelings or attitudes towards people of ethnic minority and religious minority. My story really has taught me that there is so much work that needs to be done to advocate these fundamental, universal principles, which are both American and Islamic, as me as a practicing Muslim. Those values of diversity, those values of tolerance, religious freedom, equality, and now, for me, justice. And that's why I'm able to come here today and talk about the harsh, horrible treatment that I suffered, because I think it's an obligation upon me to help make our nation be what it's supposed to be. I conclude and want to keep my comments short so that I leave time for my friends here. With that, it's an honor and pleasure, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Rabbi Jonathan Stein, Senior Rabbi of Temple Sharei Tefillah here in New York, one of the most prominent Reform Jewish congregations in the nation. Originally from Pennsylvania, he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School of Business with a BS in economics, and was later ordained from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1975. He received his honorary Doctor of Divinity in 2000. One of the reasons I wanted Rabbi Stein to join us is because of his experience in dealing with issues of interfaith, of making sure you have an opportunity to represent your constituents, your congregants, in one of the most diverse cities in the nation, if not the world. In terms of his background, He has served as the chair of the Commission on Jewish Education of Reform Judaism and as chair of the CAAR, one of the journals that works on providing information about Judaism around the country. He's also worked with the San Diego Human Relations Commission and has been recognized as an honorary member of the National Association of Temple Educators.
Chaplain Yee, thank you for your most touching and moving personal story and the interplay between religion and the law that has played out through you and through your life in recent years. I must be honest that I am certainly no expert in the question of religion and the law, but I tried to take seriously in the letter that the dean sent the two central issues that he laid out for me to introduce to you. One is a view of church-state, and the other is a little look at what tolerance might mean or should mean to us in America. Let me start with the second one first. And let me suggest to you that tolerance is probably the minimal level of a human relationship that we need in order to conduct civil discourse between people of differences. The minimum level. I'm not quite sure, to be honest with you, that I want to be tolerated. I guess it would be better than being discriminated against or suffering what the chaplain suffered. But when I hear the word tolerate, I hear something begrudging on the part of someone else toward me. I don't hear affirmation. I actually don't even hear acceptance. I hear a word that is neutral at best with a twinge of negativity in the way human beings relate to each other. So I would suggest that tolerance is the minimum necessary for us to have respectful or civil discourse in terms of a neutral public in America that needs to debate public issues. Let me focus more importantly, perhaps for just a few moments, on church-state. And I speak to you not only as an American, of course, but I will speak to you primarily as a Jew. The Jewish people have been one of the primary beneficiaries of the First Amendment to the American Constitution. There's no question that in the history of my people, we fled and came to these shores first from Brazil in 1654, fleeing the spread of the Spanish Inquisition, which had followed us from Spain in 1492 up through Amsterdam, eventually with the Dutch East and West India companies to South America and the Caribbean, and eventually to New Amsterdam. And we were fleeing religious persecution and intolerance, as were most, if not, certainly many, if not most, of the original immigrants to our country. We were all, or many of us, came here originally for religious freedom. So, and we Jews who have been extraordinarily successful in terms of American economics, the American academic and educational system, have benefited without question from the constitutional separation of church-state. America remains the only country in history where Jews, after living in that country for hundreds of years, have not yet suffered official discrimination prejudice. The only country so far, everywhere we've lived, every country has discriminated against us at one time or another, except America. So there's no question that we are advocates of and beneficiaries of the separation of church-state. Nonetheless, we recognize that the issues of church-state can in some ways be very, very difficult, and that there is, even though there are some of us in the Jewish community who have advocated for a very absolutist position about church-state, for the furthest possible separation. And therefore, many Jewish organizations find themselves arguing in the courts, most especially, for what has been characterized as the most radical of positions of separation. We recognize that many of the issues are in fact gray. For example, chaplains being paid by the government, having "In God We Trust" on our money, the fact that the government does support religion and religious institutions in a number of ways. So the separation, which in theory is wonderful, is also, of course, not absolute. And I'll give you an example from the history of my own congregation, which just about a year ago or so debated a question of church-state in our Board of Trustees. You see, about, a year, 15 months ago, the Homeland Security bill that came through Congress set aside $25 million to be spent on not-for-profit organizations to apply for funding to help them defray costs of security following 9/11. Now, $25 million across the country is not an awful lot of money, but nonetheless, all nonprofit organizations were eligible to apply, including churches, mosques, and synagogues. Our Board of Trustees had to make a very interesting and important policy decision. Whether or not it was considered by our congregation a violation of church-state were we to apply for and receive government funds in order to offset some of the significant increases in budget that my congregation has faced since 9/11. When I say that, we now have security and insurance costs that run in the hundreds of thousands of dollars more than they would have and were had there never been a 9/11. A direct result, a tax, if you will, my congregation has to put on its members as a result of being in New York City and a Jewish institution. My Board of Trustees set up a debate. We have a number of attorneys, and the attorneys debated. They took both sides, and they did research, and they argued. They argued against our application for these funds, and they argued for it. The Board of Trustees held an extraordinary debate at a very high level, and then had a vote. Now, what you must know is that we had been receiving significant pressure from our national organization, especially what a group we call the Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C., which represents Reformed Jewish interests in Congress and lobbies on our behalf. And they are almost invariably on the most liberal side of every question. And the RAC, as it is called, had been giving us multiple communications encouraging us not to apply for the funds because the act of applying and perhaps receiving would violate church-state. My Board of Trustees voted, and I may have the numbers wrong. I believe the vote was like 12-10 or 10-8. And they voted in favor of making the application. We didn't get the money. But it was a very interesting test of where the culture of at least the Board of Trustees of the congregation that I serve is, and how they understood it. And I cannot speak for all of them. I'll tell you how I understood the debate. I understood it that this was not a Jewish issue per se or a religious issue, that we were a not-for-profit that had increased costs directly as a result of the September 11th attacks, and that therefore it was not a church-state issue per se in the minds of my Board of Trustees. A few more brief comments. While separation of church and state is a fundamental proposition that makes this country work and allows three panelists like this to sit together, on the other hand, I think that it is disingenuous when people argue that church-state separation means that we should separate religion and culture or religion and politics. both of which are impossible. My liberal friends, and I count myself among my liberal friends who will talk to me about, for example, the issue of abortion, will say, oh, but the fundamentalist evangelical right-wing Christians are taking a religious position and injecting it into the political arena. And I say to them, so are you and I. My political opinion about abortion and what the government should or should not do is primarily informed by my Jewish understanding of the issue. I, inside myself, cannot separate my religious motivation and my political decisions. To try to tell me or anyone else not to do that is to ask people to bifurcate themselves, to divide themselves, and not to approach our political life as a whole human being. Now, my advocacy for simply accepting the reality that religion is a primary motivator in the lives of many people in politics does not mean that the political system should be used to further the religious ends of any particular religious point of view. But to take that and to say that you and I should divide ourselves up into parts seems to me to be moving in a very difficult and wrong direction. Last thing I'd like to suggest to you. The agenda that our country has set out on religion and law and religion and politics includes the following items: abortion, end-of-life issues, stem cell, evolution and intelligent design, prayer in the schools, school vouchers, funding of social services through churches, synagogues, and mosques, and other issues. These issues have become identified in America as religious issues that are seen as being injected into the political arena. I want to suggest to you in closing that as religious people, we are missing the boat, because the real religious issues that face this country are hunger and poverty and racism. And what's happened is that we have been diverted by these issues, which have a very narrow religious base and cause for concern. Our attention has been diverted away from hugely important societal issues that, from my point of view, are fundamentally about the way we treat each other, and they are therefore religious. They are religious issues. My tradition has something to say about hunger and poverty and racism. And my religious tradition does not like the direction this country is going in. To me, those are the fundamental issues, and we've been diverted into a different agenda. And we need to set the agenda back on a course that puts the mixture between politics and religion on track in America. Thank you.
In case you did not have a chance to read Reverend Bob Edgar's bio, he has served in our Congress in the House of Representatives from 1974 to 1987 as a Democrat representing a strongly Republican district, which is quite a feat. And because of that skill, it was one of the reasons that we wanted to make sure you had a chance to share with us your thoughts on interfaith religion, some of these issues that Rabbi Stein and Chaplain Yee have mentioned that are currently driving our debate about religion and the law. Let me just tell you a little bit more about Bob Edgar before I allow him to talk to you. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Lycoming College in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, a Master of Divinity degree from the Theological School of Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. He also holds 4 honorary doctoral degrees. An ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, and I did notice a few other United Methodist people here today. He was also president of the Claremont School of Theology in Claremont, California. He is well known for his service in Congress, as I mentioned, and he has also had stints as a teacher, a college chaplain, a community organizer, and director of a think tank on national security issues. So all of the issues we've raised to date are ones that he has addressed in his official capacities. He's also served on a number of boards, including the Independent Sector, the National Coalition for Healthcare, Common Cause, and the National Religious Partnership for the Environment.
My favorite honorary doctorate degree comes from Drew Theological School and University that turned me down as an undergraduate. We're all doing full disclosure, and I want to say to Rabbi Stein that not only do I have 6 grandchildren, 3 of whom are Jewish, but Rabbi David Saperstein, who runs the organization you mentioned, is probably my best friend in Washington and one of the best religious and faithful advocates. I won't call him a lobbyist, because that's a bad word. Chaplain Yee, I want to say to you that you are one of my heroes of this generation. Your courage under fire, your ability to withstand the persecution that you faced, your ability to articulate both through your book and through your words, and your ability to hold your pain and your anger and frustration in balance with your understanding that you, in fact, may represent for us in this day a reminder that in terms of racism, in terms of civil liberties and civil rights, you remind us how fragile those important values are, particularly in this dark time in which we live. So I honor you by simply saying how much you honor me. I want to tell a bad joke to get it out of my system. There's the story of a mother mouse that walks across the field, and she has behind her all her baby mice, all the little mices. Just as proud as can be, she gets about halfway across the field, and you guessed it, a large cat comes in the other direction. The mother mouse gets up on her back legs to protect the little ones. She looks the cat in the eye, and she says, "Bow wow." The cat runs off, and the mother mouse turns to her little ones and says, "Now you know the value of a second language." I think tonight we're here not for a discussion, but for a dialogue. If you go back to the original Greek and look at the word discussion, it means percussion, banging ideas together. What I hope will occur in your questions of us is a dialogue where we think and work and act together. I want you to hear some words of some other heroes of mine who have something to say about the times in which we live and the issues that we face. I begin, and I'll end with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King and another quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Listen to what Dr. King said. He said, "We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people." Archbishop Desmond Tutu, reflecting on a similar topic, said this: "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." In February of 1968, we were in the middle of the 60s, in the middle of civil rights and human rights, a violent time. I was a senior at theological school at Drew University, just about 45 minutes from this college. I was invited by William Sloane Coffin, who at that time was a chaplain at Yale University, to go to Washington for the first time to have a conversation with laymen and clergy persons concerned about the Vietnam War. February 1968 was a similar time to this time when we were at war, and the money that we were putting into the war was sapping the very life out of those programs that were addressing the issues of the poor. I got on the bus, went to Washington, and as I was getting off the bus, February 1968, I had to cross my first picket line. Outside were the Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertsons of that day, a guy by the name of Carl McIntyre from New Jersey, an evangelist, held a great big sign that said, "Kill a commie for Christ's sake." He tried to stop us from going inside and listening to thoughtful speakers. If you ever have heard Reverend Bill Coffin, who was a pastor at Riverside, his wonderful voice, a wonderful speaker. My favorite Coffin quote is, "God loves you the way you are, but he knows you can do better." Speaker after speaker spoke. I was up in the balcony at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, and the keynote speaker came down the aisle. A young clergy person, about 39 years of age. He stood and spoke in the podium, and then we all went out and we marched arm in arm in Arlington Cemetery together. That young preacher was Dr. Martin Luther King, just a few weeks before he was assassinated. You can imagine how big my eyes were as I listened to him. 10 years later, as a young member, I was very young. I was 31 when I got elected to Congress by accident, with the help of Ehrlichman, Haldeman, John Dean, and Richard Nixon. And yes, in the most Republican district in the nation, to have a Democratic congressman, I stumbled into Congress at age 31, having never taken a political science course. But I was one of the 12 members of the Select Committee looking into the death of Dr. Martin Luther King. I interviewed James Earl Ray, the assassin. I stood in the bathtub where he fired the shot that killed Dr. King. I share that because here are some words from Dr. King that I think are important to this conversation. In a book called Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, Dr. King said this: "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us bare, naked, and dejected with lost opportunity. The tide in the affairs of humanity does not remain at the flood, it ebbs. We may cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage, but time is deaf to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. We still have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. This may well be humankind's last chance to choose between chaos and community." I share that quote, a lengthy quote, because I think we live in a time of real challenge to our civil rights, our human rights, our people's rights, our civil liberties of all kinds. I think we live at a time when some in public office, both Democrats and Republicans, want to go back to a time when white males controlled everything. I think we live in a time when many in our society, including Democratic and Republican presidential candidates, speak of the middle class, speak of the upper class, but fail to talk about the poor. We live at a time when people have forgotten the tragic actions of a J. Edgar Hoover, who invaded people's privacy and who undermined the rights and privileges of others. I think it's important for young people today, particularly those in this diverse college, to be alert to the fact that in many instances, leaders that are calling us to move in a particular direction out of fear, out of fundamentalism, and with the help of Fox Television, are using the fear of 9/11, the words of a Pat Robertson or a Jerry Falwell or a Jim Dobson, who call for the assassination of the president of Venezuela, or say that Sharon is ill because God is punishing him for dividing Israel, or label Muhammad a terrorist. We live at a time when we need to be vigilant. I want to say three things quickly. Number one, please learn about the state of the world in which we live. In 1830, after 5 billion years of the Earth's existence, the population of our planet was 1 billion. In 1930, it reached 2 billion. In 1960, when I was in high school, it reached 3 billion. When I stood in the well of the House of Representatives in January of 1975, there were 4 billion of us. I served 6 terms, 12 years. When I left Congress in January of 1987, there were 5 billion of us on planet Earth. The United Nations says that on or about October 15th, 1999, we reached 6 billion people. There are now 6.5 billion of us consuming non-renewable resources like oil. The pressure is building. 30% of the world's population is Christian, 2/3 is non-Christian. 30% of the world's population are Anglo or white, 70% are not. A large portion of the population of the world live in substandard conditions of housing. More than half of the world's population will go to bed tonight hungry. And we live in a world where the religions of this planet, and particularly the Abrahamic traditions, Jews, Muslims, Christians, must resist our fundamentalist streams and stand together against fear, fundamentalism, and Fox Television, and towards peace, nonviolence, the eradication of poverty, and the issues of justice. And together, we must address the issues of global warming, or in fact, we will die. Secondly, we must, as we think about the world and the change that's taking place, and that there are more than half of all the people who ever lived on planet Earth are alive today, we must reconnect with our nation. Let me just say these things quickly. I believe in the separation of church and state, but not the separation of people of faith and institutions of government. So, Rabbi, you and I agree. And we agree that we don't want the institutions of our religious communities dictating government. We want people to be faithful. And on the issue of prayer in school, as long as there are final exams, there'll be prayer in school. Government doesn't have to get involved in it. But I believe, and this is the point, and I'm getting to it, I believe that this moment in our history demands that those of us who care about this fragile planet on which we live stand up when others tell us to sit down, speak out when others tell us to be silent, and follow the visionaries of people like Dr. Martin Luther King and others who were willing to face great opposition and who brought us from a society of separate and unequal and segregated to, at least for a brief moment, to understand what it means to live together in a society that respects civil rights and civil liberties and people of all walks of life and faith traditions. I've got a lot more to say, but I'm going to close by sharing one final quote. It happens to come from a politician. I wish it was Muhammad's quote. I wish it was Abraham's quote or Jesus on the Mount of Olives, but it was a politician. He said, "Let no one be discouraged by the belief that there is nothing that one man or one woman can do against the enormous array of the world's ills, against misery and ignorance, injustice, or violence. Few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events so that in the total of all those acts will be written the history of our generation." Chaplain Yee is helping to write the history of this generation. Rabbi Stein is helping to write the history of our generation. For those of you who are students, I believe, as a person of faith, that God is calling all of us to help write the history of this generation. Amen.
I just want to leave you with a statement from one of the framers of the Constitution, James Madison, who originally proposed the Bill of Rights provision concerning religion, which reads, "The civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or on any pretense infringed." The final language of the First Amendment reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." These panelists have helped us understand what that means, and I thank them.